It's helping taking the phone so it won't disturb them.
Okay. All right, we're here today with Dr. Michael Lennon,
Leave it open,
who is a professor emeritus at Wilkes University, former provost, and biographer of Norman Mailer, and a scholar in British literature. And Mike and I were talking earlier, and I said, Mike, who do you think the most important 20th century British writers are? And he said, well, Graham Greene and George Orwell. So, Mike, why did you say that, Mike?
Well, let me first preface that by saying I didn't mention any poets, because it's some great poets in the 20th century.
Yes.
You know, Thomas Hardy and Philip Larkin and you know, many others, Sylvia Plath, what have you, Ted Hughes. But poetry is not something that modern British poetry is not my area. But I have taught modern British a number of times, and it was one of my areas when I was getting my dissertation years ago. Orwell and Graham Greene are roughly contemporaries. Orwell was born in 1904, and Greene, it was around that time too. I can't remember his exact dates. And they were both novelists and essayists, and both of them came of age at a time when the British imperial apparatus was still in place, where the thin red line of British colonies went all around the world. And of course, India was part of those colonies, as well as a great number of places like Burma, as it was called then, was back in that period of time. And Orwell came from a lower middle class family. He did go to Eton and so forth, but he basically, in order to get a job in the 1920s, joined the British Foreign Service or civil service, and he became a apparatchik in the service. He was a low-level civil servant, and he was sent to Burma in the 1920s to just kind of be a bookkeeper and a bureaucrat and an enforcer, and doing all the things that needed to be done in a population that despised him. And he, of course, was also despised them to a certain extent, because they were doing horrible things to him, and back and forth, a whole miserable situation of imperialism and colonization during that period of time. But there was much restiveness. And in the midst of all this, Orwell, who was not a writer at that time, but had literary ambitions, was charged to go out and kill a rogue elephant. This would be in 1927 that this happened. And he was just a young man. He was only 23 years old at the time. And the idea of killing an elephant was a pretty horrific kind of a thing. It's like killing a whale. It's the equivalent of killing a whale. And there's something horrible about killing any creature, but killing a creature of that size, as he said, makes it seem even worse. But that was his job. And so he had to go out and kill the elephant. And this caused, this essay has become one of the most anthologized essays of the 20th century because of all the issues that are there. You have issues of identity, you have additions, of race, of oppression, of identity, and the gigantic changes that were looming on the horizon all before the Second World War, of all of these colonies breaking away from England. The English had been the great power in the world since the time of Queen Elizabeth I, 400 years before, and it was done through sea power, and they had the greatest navy in the world at that time. Even right up through the beginning of World War II, they had the greatest navy in the world. That all collapsed. So this is kind of a premonition essay, in that Orwell is sensing that things are not going well. He doesn't have enough foresight to know that it's all going to come crumbling down, in a couple of years. I mean, this essay is written is published first in 1936 on events that happened in 1927. And in 1936, it was even more severe, but nobody really knew what was going to happen. And World War II essentially saw the end of the British Empire as we know it. India was lost in 1947, and Burma and all these other places went very quickly all through the 1950s. Indonesia and Malaysia, all of those places that were essentially British colonies were born. So that's kind of the background on it. Should I talk a little bit more, a little bit about the technique of the essay?
Sure, yeah. I'd love to hear it.
Well, it's got a masterful opening. The opening is wonderful because he doesn't pull any punches about his own animosity. That's one of the surprises of the whole essay. He doesn't say, "Oh, I was a white functionary in the British Empire, and I really sympathize with these poor people that were being oppressed, and I wanted to help them any way I can, and my hands were tied." No, he doesn't say that at all. He talks about the fact that he was the young Buddhist priest would jostle him, and when he played in a football game, or what we would call a soccer game, one of the Burmese players tripped him, and the referee looked the other way, and everybody in the stands cheered. So he doesn't like this. He doesn't like being pushed around like that. He gives the example. He said, if a white woman walks through the bazaars, somebody, if no one is looking, will spit betel juice. The Burmese chewed this nut called the betel nut. It was a mild narcotic, and they would spit this brown juice on the dress of the person. So they hated the English oppressors. They wanted them to go away, and he felt oppressed himself. So killing the elephant, of course, was, as he explains very carefully, was like a costly piece of machinery, like a steam shovel. I mean, these elephants were they would tie ropes to a harness, and they would drag these huge teak logs out of the forest. And of course, the British were harvesting teak and mahogany from the forest, and the elephants were doing the work. But they did all kinds of farm work. They pulled plows. They could do all kinds of work. They're very intelligent, and they could be trained. And so they were worth a lot of money. And killing an elephant, and the owner of the elephant, nobody knew who it was at that time. The elephant was ranging through the countryside. It was going to cause a great deal of chaos. On the other hand, there was a great deal of drama, and he builds the drama up very beautifully after explaining in two beautiful opening paragraphs the situation, the political situation, the social political situation of there, which was fraught with all sorts of tensions. And in this, a young 23-year-old guy goes out and gets his hands from a friend on an elephant gun. I mean, he's got a .44 Winchester, which is, would kill anything. That's a big bullet. Nobody even files 44s or 45s anymore. They're all 38s. And then an elephant gun was like I remember from reading Hemingway, elephant guns were like 58, a 58 caliber. They were twice the size of a bullet today. Big, dumb bullets. And that's what you needed to kill an elephant. So it's a big, heavy hunting rifle that you use to kill big game. And he goes down to the area, and immediately looks, there's 2,000 people there. So not only is he got to kill this elephant, this horrible job he's given, he's going to have to kill it, and he's going to have to do it in front of an audience. And make things worse, he's a bad shot. He's not very good at this. To just digress for a moment about Orwell, Orwell was not a particularly athletic person. He was a gangling person. He was about 6'4", 6'5", big, tall, gangling person, but not very agile, couldn't run very well. And in his books that he wrote in the 30s and the 40s, put him in various situations, which his lack of athletic prowess was noted. He wrote a very, very famous book in 1936 called Homage to Catalonia, and it was about the Spanish Civil War. That was a civil war between the fascists and the Republicans, which is kind of a preview for World War II, in that the Germans and the Russians were both fighting each other on different sides of the Spanish factions. Well, for leftists around the world, and he was a socialist, he was an avowed socialist all his life, Orwell, the only thing to do was to join. And he joined the fight against the fascists, against General Franco's forces in Spain. He went to Barcelona. He was recruited. He saw it was a hopelessly chaotic situation, manipulations by the communists on the one side and Hitler and Mussolini on the other side, and they were pawns in a game. And they gave him a rifle that looked like it hadn't been used for 100 years. and he had to go out and fight. He was immediately thrown right into the battle, one of the battles, as cannon fodder. And he was in the battle for just a very short period of time. He got shot through the neck, and and he was unable. He was still a young man then. He was in his 30s though. He would be about around 32, 33, 34 years old during that war, and he was not in particularly good shape. He smoked cigarettes and so forth, and he had incipient tuberculosis, which killed him. And he shot through the neck. He was going to die, and they dragged him away. So Orwell put himself on the line as a socialist and a friend of workers all around the world in that book. And it's a marvelous study of probably the best thing ever written about the Spanish Civil War. And it's told in the first person. And of course, this essay is also told in the first person. And I think one thing to remark about the essay is that it is what, technically we would call, if we were describing the point of view, first person participant. So he's the first person participant because the story is about him. He is really the only person who is personally identified in the story. There are people in it who speak a few lines, but it's all him, and it's all of him remembering. So it's first person remembering the time he was participant, and he's a participant observer. You might liken him to, say, Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, who is both an observer and a participant, but is looking back on events in the past. So it's a classic kind of memoir essay in that regard, and it was the forerunner of all the books that he wrote in the 1930s about getting involved in political affairs. Homage to Catalonia. Then he went to Paris and London and lived in the slums and lived on the dole, lived on welfare essentially, down and out in Paris and London. He went then into the coal mines of London, the road to Wigan Pier. He went down into the coal mines and he kept banging his head against the coal face because the tunnels were for these little short Welshmen, who were 5'2", and he was 6'5" or something like that. And he came out with all kinds of gashes on his head. So he was not a very athletic sort of a guy, which is revealed later on. He was a writer and an observer and a fiercely socialistic person who believed was against all the forces of money and big government and power and all of those kinds of things. But he had a fierce wit as well, and wrote with a prose style of great clarity and force. He wrote another famous, his second, maybe his most famous essay, and Shooting an Elephant is a candidate for that, is something called Politics in the English Language, which I would urge everyone who's a writer, has any aspirations to write it, to read it for its injunctions on clarity, on force, and on honesty, how to do things, how to avoid jargon and avoid trite expressions and cliches and hackneyed expressions. He demolishes all those. And it's a very witty, clever essay, not much longer than this essay. It's also very much worth reading for anybody who likes Orwell. And of course, he wrote great novels as well. 1984 was his novel that I suppose is unforgettable and is being talked about a lot these days because of the political situation in the United States and around the world. It is discussed all the time, and it is about a government that is trying to oppress all free speech. He also wrote Animal Farm, which was an allegory about a farm in which the communists take over the farm. The communist animals take over the farm, and he was not a fan of communism or socialism that was overly bureaucratic. He opposed those as well. So he had a kind of an independent position. He wasn't a knee-jerk liberal. He saw that communism was a very poor way to run a country, and it didn't work very well. And that was his other famous book, Animal Farm. So, for all those reasons, he's one of the most justly recognized writers of the 20th century. I don't think he's ever gone out of favor. I don't think his books have ever gone out of print, especially his two novels and his collected essays. So back to the essay, just quickly. I'm just looking at my notes here, and one of the other things is why the animal is, and I didn't know this, I never understood this, and in reading the essay again, I must have forgotten it, but the animal was in heat. It was a male animal, but elephants go through something called must, M-U-S-T-H. He left the H off, he just called it must. And where animals just go into the sexual frenzy, and they are looking for a female, and if they can't find one, they start wrecking things, and it's just uncontrollable. And the animal trainers know how to handle this. And it just happens, I guess once a year to young elephants, and they become crazy. And so that's what he was dealing with. That was the problem. And so everybody knew about this. This was something that happened. It was just a seasonal thing. And also, as much as they prized elephants and they liked them, when elephants died, they ate them. And so after he shoots the elephant, and of course he botches that in that he hits the elephant in the wrong place. He gives the elephant head wounds, but he doesn't hit the brain. So he probably blinded the elephant because he's sitting in the front. And then he shoots all of his 5 cartridges, then gets his 44 and goes and shoots the elephant again, tries to get its heart. And the poor elephant, the description of the dying elephant is one of the most pitiful things I've ever seen. And the metaphor he uses is age. He said the elephant seemed to become immensely old and senile all at once, as all of its systems shut down. And of course, elephants don't fall over slowly. They fall over, quickly. They fall over slowly. They go down in pieces. And that's what this poor elephant does. So the pity for the elephant that any human being who reads this story would feel is really profound. This poor beast who was, just following its own instincts. And indeed, it seemed that he had passed through that period, because when he comes upon the elephant, all the elephant is doing is pulling up grass, banging it on its leg to knock the dirt off, and then eating it. So the elephant has kind of calmed down, but still, the elephant has killed a black coolie, a worker, the lowest of the low worker, and he's lying there on the ground, had been squashed, pushed into the earth by the elephant's foot. So this, of course, is murder, or it's mayhem anyway. It isn't. You can't really call it murder from an animal, but the people are outraged, and that gives him, of course, carte blanche to kill the elephant, which he does. Finally, the elephant finally dies, and he goes back to his home. And he says in one of the most candid admissions that really cements the essay, this candid admissions about his feeling all the time. He doesn't spare himself. Most first-person narrators are self-protective. They put up all kinds of shields of evasions and excuses about, well, I was tired, or this or that, giving reasons why they are performing their actions. If they have to reveal something bad about themselves, they're their own best lawyer. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do it at the beginning, and he ends the essay with the death of the elephant, saying that he was happy that the coolie had been killed because it gave him permission to kill the elephant, and all he really wanted to do was not look like a fool. And that's how the essay ends. So it's savagely revealing of his own feelings. He does not spare himself. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that he was such a great memoirist. He was a great novelist. There's no doubt about that. But he wrote several other novels as well. But he was dead, by the time he was 50 years old. And he had written a dozen books by that time. And this was the start of his very, very fine career. So.
Wow. And, just going through that incredibly poignant story and revealing story too, Mike, I mean, in our time frame right now, this story has taken on even darker and greater significance.
Yes.
As we see these forces. I think everybody is wondering, how is it possible for the police to behave the way they do?
Yes. Yes.
And when you see this example, you realize that I think this motivation of not appearing weak,
right,
is really very much with us today.
Yes, not appearing weak, standing up, being strong, and so forth, projecting power, projecting strength, implacability. All of those things, yes, are applying, and they apply to the situation with the death of George Floyd today. It's the same kind of situation. And in this case, there's a death and so forth. Nobody seems to be mourning the death of the black man in this story. Nobody seems at all. He is expendable. He isn't even considered. And he says that. He says as much about that. So it's a brutally frank essay. And of course, it was something that he never forgot. Even after he died, people were coming to his wife, Sonia Brownell, who was his wife, who he married right at the end of his life. And she was much younger than him. She only died a few years ago. She carried the torch. And they said, is this really true? I mean, we can't find anything in the records that he killed this elephant. Apparently, there were stories of other people doing it. And she said, yes, he killed the effing elephant. She said, I know he killed the effing elephant. I found that out when I was poking around about this. So yeah, it's an essay for the ages.
You know, I was talking earlier before we started recording about the fact that I've connected with this former student of mine from 40 years ago at the University of Lubumbashi, Felix Kaputu, and the students are going to hear from Felix later.
Oh, terrific.
But my own small experience with that kind of thing was through basketball, where as an American in what was then called Zaire, I was considered a kind of, special presence because basketball was American and they were just kind of learning the game. But I'll never forget one game, it was 90 degrees or whatever. And I was out there and the referees did, the referees did kind of screw me occasionally. But at one point, I guess I was not playing well and kind of, just not running very, very hard. And somebody in the crowd yelled, Mzungu e Palliser, the white guy's lazy.
You never forgot it.
I just like, oh man, like, the crowd erupted in laughter. It's like I went from being l'Americain to Le Mzungu, and
that's a great line.
Yeah,
we remember those moments.
Oh yeah. So thankfully there were no elephants around. They would have been endangered. So hey, let's talk a little bit about the other writer that you brought up, Graham Greene.
Yeah, Graham Greene. He he's a contemporary. I'm trying to figure out what his dates were. I thought I wrote them down, but I don't know when they were. But he was born in 1904. So he's born the same year. They were the same age. He was born in 1904, and he lived a very long life. And he died, in the late 90s. He was in his mid 80s when he died. One very pertinent fact about Graham Greene: he came from a kind of a lower middle class family, maybe a rung higher on the economic ladder than Orwell. His family were, middle class, but he never went to a university, as did Orwell. Both of them went to prep school, what we would call prep school. The English called them the public schools. He went to them. But one very pertinent fact about him is that he was a very puny kid, and people picked on him. And when he was in school, there were a couple of very clever sadists who chose him as their particular target. And they chose him, and they kept it up, various kinds of humiliations and tortures and so forth, hiding his clothes and doing things to him, pushing him around, stuff like that, all through a 2 or 3 year period when he was in prep school. He was seriously psychologically troubled by this. In fact, during his life, Graham Greene tried to commit suicide 2 or 3 times. He was deeply depressed at periods of life. And this is during his young life when he was starting off. And he also, like Orwell, worked in the British civil service. So they had a lot in common. But in his case, he was sent, and he was in Africa. He was down in, I think, what is now called Benin, I believe. Was Dahomey? No, it wasn't that. It was whatever the British colony was down there. Maybe it was the Gold Coast. I think it was the Gold Coast, which is near Benin, down there in that area. It could have been Nigeria. I can't remember. But he was there during the Second World War, He wrote a wonderful novel of about his time there and about the decrepit the decrepit civil service of the British government, again, like Orwell, in a novel called The Heart of the Matter, which I think is one of his finest novels about a British civil servant. And it's about a love affair. And he wrote a lot about love affairs. He wrote a number of novels that had love affairs in them. He was a tortured Catholic all of his life, and he never fully got over it. Later on, he kind of dropped away from the church, but during this period of time, he was a Catholic all through the middle of his life, and that takes a big part of him. One of his other famous novels is called The Power and the Glory, and it takes place in Mexico, and his hero is an alcoholic priest known as the Whiskey Priest. And it's during the time of revolution in the 1930s in Mexico. The thing about Greene was he went to all these places. He went to Mexico. He went to Malaysia. He was there in the same places in Burma during the Second World War that Orwell was. So they were close like that. He went to Mexico. He went to Africa. He went to Cuba. He wrote a famous book called Our Man in Havana. He traveled all through the extent of the old British Empire, and also into places where America had power, like Cuba. And he's not noted for writing books that are set in England. He did set some in England. He wrote probably his most famous two English novels. One is called Brighton Rock, and Brighton Rock is a candy that you buy in Brighton, which is a seaside town, a resort town in England. I remember Donna and I went there years ago when we were in England, and I said, "Yeah, I want to go. What is this rock? Is this like Plymouth Rock in Plymouth? I want to go see this rock. There must be some famous Brighton Rock. Maybe Sir Francis Drake put his foot on it, or Queen Elizabeth." Well, I went there and I found that Brighton Rock was candy. It's a candy, like a candy cane. I had no idea at the time. And then I read the novel. It was a great novel. And he also wrote a book called The End of the Affair, which has been made into a movie more than once. William Faulkner and Norman Mailer both said it's the best book they had ever read about an affair. And it takes place during the Blitz in London in 1941, 42, that period there. It's a fantastic short novel. So he did set some novels in England, but I would say the bulk of his writing, and he was a very prolific writer. He must have written 30 different books, every kind of thing you can imagine. He wrote film scripts, he wrote plays, he wrote novels, he wrote many essays, he wrote short stories, he wrote everything. And the short story that we're going to talk about today, After the Party, is one of his most famous short stories. Probably his most famous short story is After the Party, and it is set in England, and it is the story of twin brothers. I like the story immensely. I'd never read it before. I found I had it in a book of short stories of Greene's, but I guess I didn't read it because I had no memory of it when I read it. And it's a magnificent story. It's in the British tradition of the horror tale, very droll, told in this you can feel the influence of Edgar Allan Poe in this story. I guess anybody who writes a horror tale feels the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, no matter where they live, in Russia, certainly in France, but all over the world. Poe's influence on creating a mood, a macabre mood, with dark imagery. The raven in Poe's poem has spread his wings all over Gothic horror stories for over a century. And of course, there are bats in this story. That's one of the images. There are no real bats, but of course, in the darkness, they keep imagining bats and thinking about bats. And so that's part of it. So this is a story of two young boys. It appears, you figure it out finally. He doesn't come out and tell you exactly, but they're 9 years old, and they're twins, Peter and Francis. And Peter, I don't want to get them mixed up now. Peter is the older one, and he is the guardian of his younger brother, Francis. And they're born instants apart, just a few moments apart, but they're remarkably different in their outlooks on life. One is Peter is a take charge kind of a person. He's not afraid. He steps into the breach all the time, and he has assumed the role of guardian over his much more the tender sensibilities of his younger brother, Francis, who is born with fear in his heart. We don't really know how this happened, whether it was just an accident of birth or his DNA. He shares the same DNA as his brother. They are identical twins, and I have identical twin sisters. And this story really rang a big bell for me as I was reading it, because he notes in the story that sometimes they would fool around and one would pretend to be the other. And they began to assume each other's identities. Because, this could just be childhood fear on the part of Francis. And he could have grown out of it. And a lot of young children, when they're that age, are afraid of the dark. But I know that my own sisters did that all the time. To this day, most people in the world can't tell my sisters apart. They look exactly the same, Kathleen and Maureen. And but in my case, it's the younger sister who's the take charge person. The older sister failed her driving test like 3 times. She panicked every time she took the test. And so finally Maureen said, all right, get out of the way. And she went and said, my name is Kathleen Lennon. She took the test and passed it. And so I always remind my sisters every time I see them, now, Kathy, are you checked out in this car? Can you drive this? You never actually got your shut up. So they do that. They would do that all the time. They actually went on dates with different boyfriends. They would say, okay, and they'd come down and say, hey, yeah, of course it's me, And then they would come back and find things out about their sister's boyfriends. And so only members of the family could tell them apart. And we couldn't do it all the time, not when they were young. Kathy had 2 freckles right here that were just slightly larger. They were both red-headed, freckle-faced Irish Colleens. And I could tell Kathy by her 2 freckles. And they went on to lead different lives and then moved back in with each other, where they still are today. So I'm going to tell them about this story. I said, you've got to read this story. And I'm always sending them twin stuff. So it really rang a bell to me because, let's say, the operative principle of this story that really makes it work is the ability of the brothers to enter into the sensibility, enter into the feelings of the other one. So Peter knows and intuits the fears that his brother is going through about going to this party. He knows his brother doesn't want to go, and he does everything to say, I'm going to be there, I'm going to help you. He feels for his brother. He is his brother's keeper. He is, if the song Lean on Me was around then, he would be singing that song to his brother, Lean on Me. And that's what his brother does. His brother leans on him all the time, and he feels that's his job. That's just the way it is. It's kind of an existential situation. One brother has to take care of the other one, and that's all there is to it. And there's no rhyme, no reason for it. I mean, there was no traumatic event that made this happen. It just happened, and you live it and you go through it. And you don't even question it. And that's what happens throughout the story. So the progress of the story is marked beautifully and with great economy. This story is only a couple thousand words long. It's very, very brief. It's almost a vignette. But he covers a lot of ground in the story with great economy. He sketches out the situations of the children. And what we learn pretty quickly is that they are the only 2 males in the story. Maybe some men are mentioned, but there's no father figure that's involved in this. There's the mother figure, and she is kind of very blithe. Yes, you're going to the party. Of course, you're going to the party. And there's a nurse, the family nurse, so this makes them kind of a little more of an upper class family to have a nurse for 2 9-year-old boys. She takes them, says, of course you're going to the party. And she's got a flashlight. A light and dark imagery all throughout the story is very powerful. There's all kinds of light imagery through the story, including the biggest symbol, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. And so they're invited to go to this party. And the particular reason that Francis doesn't want to go is because Mabel and Joyce are going to be there. And we learn that Mabel and Joyce are sisters, and one is 11, 2 years older than him. And worse yet, Joyce is 11 and Mabel is 13. She's 4 years older. She is, in puberty. He is, of course, just the edges of puberty, but he's feeling it. There's a lot of let's say subtle sexual imagery in it. He is kind of oppressed by the prominent breasts of the woman running the party, which he is right at eye level with, and they're mentioned a couple of times in the story. The two girls have long braids that they're wearing, and they swing those in kind of a very aggressive masculine way, and he is kind of oppressed by that. So the fears that young boys often have about girls who tend to mature earlier are stronger, more self-assured in many cases. These are people that are in what are they in? We're talking about people that are in third grade, in fourth grade. Maybe the 13-year-old is in seventh grade or eighth grade, or yes, probably seventh or eighth grade. So he's about 4 years behind her. He's maybe in fourth grade and she's maybe in eighth grade. And so he's afraid of the girls because they make fun of him. They belittle him. They are aware of his weaknesses and they take advantage of them, and he knows that they will. He knows because he remembers a previous party and he was in the dark, he was hiding, it was all alone, and one of the sisters came up and put her hand on his arm and scared the heck out of him. And he is afraid that this is going to happen again. And so to avoid this, they play various games at the parties, bobbing for apples and things like that. But the great fun of the party always is the last thing, where they play what we would call in America, hide and seek. And they have a different name for it. I think they call it searching or something like that. But it's basically a hide and seek game. And he goes, is it going to be in the dark? Will all the lights be out? Yes, all the lights will be out. And the big chandelier goes off. The light and dark imagery is set up by the very opening sentences of the story, when there is a candle on the table and he wakes in the morning, Francis does, and the candle has burned itself out. And it's just there. The guttered candle has burned itself out. The light that he needed a night light, and the night light was a candle, and the candle burned out, and so he went into the darkness. And that's kind of a symbol of the whole story. So knowing that the girls are there, knowing they're going to play the games, he does everything he can, every kind of hesitation and prevarication that he can put up, feeble attempts. First of all, to not go to the party, to pretend he's sick, to say that it's too late, to say that, every kind of excuse. And these are summarily pushed apart by all the women in the story. No, you're going. Of course you're going. You're going to have a great time. It's going to be wonderful. And his brother Peter knows that he's got to go. He isn't going to work. They're going to have to go. And they all tread through the dark, the light of this torch, a flashlight that the nurse has, go to the party. And all through the party, he's waiting for the end of the party to come. When that happens, he's going to have to play this game for 45 minutes. From 5:45 to 6:30, I believe, he's going to have to live in the dark. And his brother is right next to him. The lights go out, and he's standing, and there's a big chandelier, and then they're in this big room with a chandelier with many lights on it, electric lights, and it goes out, and everybody evaporates and runs to this is a big house with 3 floors, and they're hiding all over the house. He, of course, freezes and stands right there. And finally, he goes to hide in a niche between the bookcase and the wall, or a chair. A bookcase and the sofa, I think, is like a little place. And he gets in there and crouches down in that little place. And things are completely dark. And he just hopes that he can stay there until the lights come back on again. That's all he wants, is the lights to come back on. There is an exquisite rendering of the consciousness of the two boys as they think about their situations. Peter is thinking only of his brother and what he can do. He is feeling his brother's pain all the way through. He's feeling his fears. He's feeling his anxieties. He's projecting everything in him to his brother. He realizes his brother is all alone. His brother is fearful. He knows where his brother is hiding. And at a certain point in the story, he feels that his brother needs him to be next to him. Of course, he has misconstrued this to a certain extent, because what his brother is looking for is he's expecting something, but he's expecting the hand of Mabel or the hand of Joyce to be on him, to touch him when he's not expecting it, and he will shriek and cry and scream as he did at a previous party. And of course, that brought on humiliation, afraid of the dark. So he's not only afraid of being touched, he's afraid of what's going to happen after that. So he's got a whole ladder of fears that he is traversing. When will the lights go on? Will they find me? Will I scream? Who will it be? His brother only wants to help him, and his brother goes in and does the same thing, touches him, and his heart explodes and he dies. And the story ends with the light coming back on. The chandelier explodes in a collision of light. And the irony of the whole thing is the brother, who has great empathy, great forbearance, great love of his brother, has killed him. He's been killed with kindness. He's been killed by an act of kindness on the part of his brother. His keeper has killed him. Yeah, I don't want to compare it to the elephant, but you know, but you know, the elephant is also killed, you know, in a kind of an unwitting way as well. If you wanted to draw an imaginary line between these two stories, so it's a masterpiece of horror, a masterpiece of fear, and the fear is all inside the head of Francis. That's where it resides. There isn't somebody looming over him trying to cut his head off with an axe or anything. It's not Stephen King kind of horror. It's psychological horror. And Edgar Allan Poe was probably one of, not the first, but he was the one who truly recognized and brought to the fore the whole notion that the worst kind of horror is mental horror. If you think of a story like the Cask of Amontillado, where Fortunato is bricked up in a basement down in the catacombs in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, and his greatest pain comes when he realized that he has put himself in the position of being bricked up through his own pride of going down looking for a cask of obscure wine called Amontillado. It's the same kind of horror that he realizes that, and his executioner is fully aware that this is going to be the worst pain, not the pain of dying of starvation, but the pain of knowing that he put himself in his own death trap. We don't have that exactly here, but we have a similar kind of situation in that it's a really more complex situation, because Peter wants to help Francis. He does everything in his power to do it, but and that's what's so horrible, is that an act of kindness causes the death of a beloved person. So, magnificent story.
Yeah, and you know, when you talk about the comparison, of course, it's grotesque, you know, in the sense of there's an elephant, there's a person, and they're very, very different. But it seems like also in both of these stories, you know, good and evil are presented in such nuanced,
yes,
and complicated ways.
Yes.
That makes, I think, readers feel somewhat powerless to navigate the world by any particular institution or belief system. You know, I think that's one of the things that, and perhaps that might very well be the gift of these two writers that you've chosen as the most important writers, is reminding us of the artificiality of any potential saving belief system that you may follow, whether it's political or religious or psychological or personal. You know, we are all in the dark.
Yes.
And,
yes. Absolutely. The forces of good are not untrammeled. They're beset by all kinds of conflicts and misunderstandings. You know, you could say that the misunderstandings cause the two deaths in these two stories. I mean, there's a great misunderstanding of, but you know, the class system and the colonial system, you might say, is the villain in the first story that sets up this situation. In the second story, well, you know, you know, right now we're living through the Me Too movement, and we've all the various ways that women have been preyed upon and suffered and tortured and raped and so on, and how that's been hidden by the system and swept under the rug, and the outrage that is creeping out now. Graham Greene was writing a story about a different kind of oppression, and it was, you know, the young boys being in the hands of older women, and it's sort of age oppression is more than anything else. That these women are older than him, and they don't have any kind of real sympathy for the sensibilities of these young people. You could easily have reversed it and have young girls at the hands of men as well. So it really, in that sense, is gender neutral. But in this particular case, Graham Greene was a boy, and he probably had situations that he was drawing on in his own life where uncaring or unthinking older women were pushing him around, you know, like a pawn, and drew on those in writing the story.
Mike Lennon, thanks so much for joining us today. It was
been
great
my pleasure.
fun.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it immensely.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.